Hi, my name is Julian Brown, and what I want to demonstrate in this report about how to increase social mobility in America is that there's no single factor that has caused the decline of social mobility. There's no single policy that will reverse its decline. What I also want to demonstrate is that when it comes to social mobility, everything is interconnected. Urban planning, whether you have walkable cities or suburban sprawl, determines commute times. School district zoning can reduce or perpetuate racial segregation. And as we are all working from home, having high-speed broadband can determine your educational outcomes. The decline of America's social mobility was not inevitable. Many European countries and Canada have far higher levels of social mobility. This crisis is the result of bad policy decisions. The good news is that it can be fixed by good ones. According to the work of Harvard economist Raj Shetty, who focuses on poverty and social mobility, there are five primary characteristics that determine social mobility. Number one is segregation. Income and racial segregation have the strongest association to lower social mobility. Long commute times and sprawl are strongly associated with less mobility. Number two, income inequality. Places with smaller middle classes have much less social mobility. Number three, family structure. Areas with more single parents have much lower social mobility. However, this is a strong correlation even for kids whose own parents are married. Number four, social capital. The metaphor, it takes a village to raise a child, could not be more accurate. Lack of social networks, opportunities, and positive role models can be detrimental to future success. Number five, school quality. Greater expenditure, smaller classes, and higher test scores correlate with more mobility. However, there's clear evidence of a spillover effect from other factors. Housing policy is one of the most important considerations when looking to increase social mobility. According to many economists, including Shetty, where you grow up is the most important indicator of your social mobility and income levels. Living in segregated and low-income communities not only limits your access to jobs, education, and lengthening commute times, but also increases the likelihood of traumatic childhood experiences. What the work of Chetty shows is that your childhood experience is largely what determines your future. Where you live will largely determine what experiences you will have. One policy that has been proven to be very successful in increasing social mobility is giving low-income families housing vouchers to move to higher income areas. In a Department of Housing and Urban Development experiment, they did this for 4,600 families, and they found that children who moved to higher income areas were 30% more likely to be high earners, attend college, and have stable families. Reinforcing the conclusion that childhood exposure is a key factor of upward mobility, this policy was more effective the younger the child involved. Housing vouchers and other government programs, while potentially very effective, are alone not nearly sufficient to increase social mobility and end generational poverty. This is because there are only so many homes in high opportunity areas for low income people to move to. When housing demands are far higher than housing supply, the result is an affordability crisis where the areas that have the most jobs and opportunities paradoxically become the most unaffordable and unequal. What's causing this is NIMBY zoning laws and land use restrictions for things like parking and preventing multi-family homes. When this happens, any housing development is forced to become either urban or suburban sprawl, exacerbating inequality in the process. The response to the housing crisis happening in cities all across the country, there has been a growing movement to allow for denser housing. Reforming zoning laws to allow for dense housing developments near transit stops is crucial to make housing affordable. This has been done in places like Oregon and Minneapolis, which legalized building duplex homes, and the result has been a boom in housing construction and a lowering of prices. When it comes to improving social mobility, everything comes back to zoning laws. The denser the city, the shorter the commute. Public transportation becomes vastly more effective, and there are far more opportunities for low-income people living in mixed-income communities. Parking requirements create an immense amount of wasted space. In a city like Seattle, parking takes up 40% of land area. Not only does this wasted space mean less homes, but it incentivizes traffic and reduces walkability. The only thing parking requirements succeed in is artificially incentivizing car usage. The result is less investment in public transport, mass transit, biking, and sidewalks, which we know are much more effective and conducive to social mobility. This brings me to infrastructure. Infrastructure needs to go hand in hand with housing policy. Infrastructure needs to be about integrating communities, not just building more roads and highways. The denser the city, the more efficient buses, trains, and bikes will be. But we can't rely on housing density alone to fix transportation needs. Smart and large investments in mass transit, subways, bike lanes, buses, and highways within major cities is desperately needed. Cars and roads certainly have a role to play, but relying on them to be the primary source of transportation in metro areas has been one of the biggest mistakes in the history of urban planning and has exacerbated commute times and inequality. In the 1970s, Portland, Oregon had the same rates of biking as the rest of America, but over the last 40 years, the city has invested about $60 million in cycling infrastructure. The result is that people in Portland bike to work at a rate that is more than 14 times the national average. What this shows is that we can make smart investments in cycle infrastructure and walkability, which costs a fraction of what other transportation costs, and people will be more socially mobile as a result. In cities all across the country, when initiatives have led to increased walkability, it has boomed in popularity, and there's been a lot of pressure for cities to go in that direction. When walking or biking are not viable options, mass transit is essential to social mobility. While not cheap, mass transit in the form of buses, trains, and subways is essential to integrating communities and shortening commute times. This is another area where America falls behind greatly and needs a massive investment to catch up. When Harvard economists Nathan Hendren and Ben Sprung-Keyser looked at the return on investment for social programs, they found that programs that invested in kids developing their human capital and education have very high rates of return, and in some cases infinite rates of return because they fully pay for themselves in the form of future tax revenue created. Therefore, investing in early education programs does not cost the government anything on the net because of the higher earnings that kids achieve later in their lives. These benefits are most profound the younger the child. In light of this, it is evident that investing heavily in early childhood development and education is the best way to increase social mobility and is beneficial to everyone. While not as beneficial as investing in early childhood education, policies that benefit teenagers and college students by making tuition more affordable has immense positive externalities as well and can result in far greater social mobility. The biggest problem in rural communities face is a lack of human capital and opportunities. Both of these problems can be solved if there is a massive investment in rural education. This will create the human capital which both attracts and creates opportunities and increases social mobility. Skills and learning are vital, but so is connectivity. 4 in 10 rural Americans lack access to high-speed broadband service compared to only 4% of the urban population. This rural-urban digital divide severely limits the ability of rural populations to benefit from the modern economy and receive a 21st century education. Like the government did for electricity in the past, the government must invest in rural broadband connectivity. There is a strong link between family structure and upward mobility. Family instability and unplanned pregnancies, which are higher in rural areas, have strong correlations to poor educational and labor market outcomes. Through family planning, contraceptive and sex education initiatives, the government could greatly reduce these social ills. While I did not touch on all the areas that are leading to diminished social mobility, these areas are very likely the most consequential. Thank you for listening.